So in the previous videos, we were talking about forests, and now we're going to move on to a different kind of ecosystem, which are grasslands. We have two different ways that we graze livestock, or we provide food for livestock, and one of those is on rangelands, and one of them is on pastures. So we're going to talk about a little bit about both of those kinds of things, and looking how we can sustain that productivity by controlling what's on our our rangelands. So a great deal of our national forests and our Bureau of Land Management land is rangeland. And even down here in the desert area, we have a lot of area that's managed for cattle. You'll see where the fence lines are up. Usually if there's fence lines, it's either to keep cows in or keep cows out, one of the two things. The problem is that if we're in an area where you have too many cows in an area, or you leave them there for too long, what you can create are deserts, because you exceed the carrying capacity, and when that happens, they eat up all the grass. Cows are actually pretty damaging also to the root systems of plants because they're so heavy and their hooves are kind of sharp. They tear up the ground as well. And so it's really important not only to not have too many cows in a particular area, but also to keep them moving in the area. So cows need a couple of things to sustain themselves. One thing they need is water, and the other thing they need is salt, in addition to the grass that they eat. And so in this particular area, what you see is that cows are essentially very lazy creatures, and if they can hang out by their water source with the grass source close by, they're not going to go very many places. And so in this particular area, what you're seeing is the San Pedro River, where the cows hung out in the waterways a lot. And so because they're heavy, they have sharp hooves, as they walk up and down the banks, they cause a lot of bank degradation. So they're pushing it down, they're churning it up, they're causing erosion to occur, they're causing that movement of the dirt around. They also will like to hang out in those areas, and so it gets even more impacted. So on the right hand side, what you see is an area that was fenced off, and they weren't allowed in that area. You can see how well the vegetation, the streamside vegetation, was able to come back. Anytime you have water in an area, you're more likely, and it's relatively flat, once again, this doesn't apply to those real steep slopes, but if you're in a relatively flat area and you've got water available, it usually doesn't take as long for streamside vegetation or that riparian area vegetation to come back. So with cows, it's really important to separate out their sources to keep the cows moving, and then also to change them from pasture to pasture, like to move them around, and so that they don't hang out in one particular area too long. So some of these things are what I already said. One of them that I didn't mention was about the growth of invader plants like thistles. So invasive species, remember, once again, are ones that can really outcompete our other species. And so if our cows, for example, are eating a lot of our native grasses, then that gives a thistle an opportunity to come and sort of establish itself. And eventually it could choke out some of the grasses. And so thistle, for particular, is considered a noxious weed. And it's you're required by law, if it's on your property, to control thistles. So for the federal government, that means that they also have to control the thistles, which can be kind of a big job when you're thinking about the national forest. Back in the early 1990s, I worked for the Pagosa Springs Ranger District in southern Colorado. And one of my jobs, I worked for the range crew, and one of my jobs was to go around in different areas, and we were spraying for thistles because we were trying to control that thistle population. So we do, it actually does happen. Sometimes it can happen through mechanical means. They'll actually take people out and they'll pull them out, and sometimes it'll happen through herbicides. We can also replant the areas. If we replant them with the native seeds, the things that were already growing there, we can help to kind of choke out some of those invader plants, and we can help to sustain the grasslands in those areas, keep some of those invader species from coming in. Another way we manage our lands is through national parks. So we've had our forests, we've had our grasslands, now we're going to talk about national parks. National parks are intrinsically different from national forests. National forests are managed for multiple use. National parks are not. National parks are an exclusive area and is just for recreation. It's for conservation of the resource. And so all the things that are down on the bottom there where they're talking about some issues and threats to human activities, the reason that there's threats is because they've excluded those human uses. They're not allowed to mine, they're not allowed to log, they're not allowed to have cows in there, they're not allowed to do any of those kinds of things in national parks, but when people live close by, sometimes they want to do those things anyhow. And that's where we have these these pressures from the human activities. Sometimes the national parks, the idea is that they can help to support some of our larger animal species, particularly those that are endangered, but they might not be quite big enough for that. And so that can cause a little bit of controversy. So things like the reestablishment of the wolf in Yellowstone, wolves have an extremely large range, and they don't really pay attention to signs or anything like that. And so the wolves will leave the park, and that's when there becomes an issue with that. So, and then we have an invasive species problem because it's a real hands-off kind of area. We kind of let nature run its course. Unfortunately, sometimes that means invasive species kind of come in. So when we look at what can we do about it, some of it's about just how do we manage the parks, and some of it's from like the loving it to death, that there's so many people come into some of our parks, that so much traffic and so many people and so much trash and so much of all of that. How do we lessen some of those impacts? In some of the national parks, they don't sell plastic water bottles anymore. All they have are the water refilling stations, and so they're trying to cut down on the amount of garbage that they produce by doing things like that. Some ways that we can do it, it's kind of a carrot and a stick. We can try to increase funds from the federal level, but that money has to come from somewhere. And so do we do that by charging, higher taxes, higher fees? How do we maintain those parklands? Are there some of our parklands that need to be increased in size? Is there a way to actually acquire land around it, but either through land trades or outright purchases, that kind of thing? And some of it's also about trying to find sponsors. Finding people who are interested in a particular park, saying, hey, can you come in? Can you sponsor talks? Can you sponsor, trash pickup? What can you sponsor in particular areas to try to help out with the funding issues? We also have nature preserves or reserves. In the United States, we call these wilderness areas for the most part. So when we look at protecting biodiversity and sustaining some of those areas, this is where we're looking at kind of those hot spots around the country about where do most of the endangered species happen, where are these really sensitive areas, and how can we preserve areas right around that. And so Costa Rica is really actually very good at this. They were having problems with their economy. They're like, what can we do in order to increase our economy and increase the amount of money coming in? And what they saw was they had all this wonderful natural resources around that could actually work for them. And so they kind of changed the way that they were managing these particular areas by purchasing some of these inholdings and then trying to establish the reserves and the parks in order to preserve them. And they did this through the mega reserve area, and we'll look at the different parts of these. Now, what that's done for them, economically speaking, is that where they could have cut down the timber, and harvest it and that kind of stuff, what they're finding instead is that ecotourism went through the roof, and so now they have an industry that's highly reliant on people coming in and enjoying the natural resource without actually using it up. And so when we talk about the nature reserves, you can see that a lot of Costa Rica is in these nature reserves, and that's where they're preserving their biodiversity. But you can see how they're kind of connected in here, because remember we talked about habitat fragmentation. So it's important that when we're looking at preserving it from also the animal point of view, that these reserve areas are connected so they can move from one area to the next in there. And so what they have is in the core areas, where the core area is preservation. This is an area where you visit, you can come in and you can recreate, but really this is an area that not a whole lot happens there, and particularly not a whole lot of human multiple uses happen there. So there's no mining, there's no logging, there's none of that that's happening in there. It's primarily used for recreational purposes. If you go camping there, you're doing throwdown, you're doing wilderness type camping. And then you have the buffer zone that's on the outside of it, around that, which is where you can start to have some tourism, some information, things like that, but still we're not using it for settlements, we're not using it for harvesting or anything like that. And then as we move further out, now we start to see settlements, now we start to see some of that multiple use, but we've protected that bigger area and protected the biodiversity that's within it. So we talked about this a little bit already. The conservation biologists are the people who are actually working with local communities to try to help to protect the biodiversity and provide a substitute. So it's not just saying, hey, no, you can't use this, you can't mine here, you can't log here, anything like that. Let's figure out something else you can do to make money. So they're not just saying no, they're saying let's work together and figure out how this area could actually benefit you with it still being in existence for future generations. So it's just taking a look at some of the hot spots, which is one areas that we want to focus our efforts on. And you can see that pretty much all of Central America is in that. So Costa Rica is right along the, right on the bright lines. You can see a lot of it happens in the rainforest areas. So here in the United States, we call them wilderness areas. Wilderness is where, the take only pictures, leave only footprints comes from. The Wilderness Act of 1964 is what established our wilderness system. And you can't bring anything mechanical into it. You can't bring cars, you can't bring planes, you can't bring chainsaws, you can't bring any of that kind of stuff in there. So it's all non-mechanized. You have to walk. Camping is thrown down. There's no campsites, that kind of stuff. So wilderness areas are really set aside to be the way they were pre-settlement. So when we have all these different areas, we manage them different ways, we know that we haven't always done the best job. So we have to look at how is it that we can help certain areas and kind of try to bring them back. And there's different ways of trying to bring back ecosystems or to restore them to where they were before. So we have restoration, and that's trying to get it back to the way it was. This is hard to do, and so we don't always achieve this. A lot of times we're in one of these other descriptors, like the rehabilitation, just trying to get it back to something that'll work again. So in British Columbia, there's this area called Bouchard Gardens. It was a open pit mine, so it was a mountain at one point in time, and so obviously they can't restore it back to the mountain. But what they've done in the pit is they've actually turned it into the largest rose garden in Canada. And so it's this whole huge multi-tiered gorgeous area that's functional, it's beautiful, and it has ecological value again, but they couldn't restore it back to what they were. Replacement is taking a degraded ecosystem and putting in a whole other kind of ecosystem. So if you were in a wetlands area but you've drained all the water out of it, turning into a grassland, something like that. And then we have the artificial ecosystems. There's one of these down in Gilbert where they actually have created a wetlands that's being used for sewage treatment, which is kind of cool. When we look at the principles for ecological restoration, first we have to figure out what's happening, why it's happening, and then we have to stop the thing that's happening. Then we start to bring back the species, because it doesn't do any good to bring back the species if we're still doing what was causing the problem. And then we try to protect it from anything else that's going to happen and use those management strategies to make sure that what we're doing is working, and that see if we have to modify and adjust as we move along. There is a concern that sometimes if you try to restore areas that it could encourage that future destruction, but it's also saying that, are we just going to leave it the way it is? So we want to prevent the ecosystem damage, because we always talk about prevention is cheaper than cleanup afterwards. But we have to acknowledge the fact that we do have some of these areas that do need restoration. And so we're not just going to leave them the way that they are. So we still want to have that eye on the prevention, but we still want to fix our mistakes.